Informed consent and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. Welcome, everyone. We also want to welcome Dr. Jim Small. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back.
We are very happy to have Dr. Small back because we are going to talk about the issue of informed consent. This is really important stuff. Actually, as I've discussed this more with Dr. Small in private, what I've realized is how little people know what this term actually means and why it's so important, especially in an age of constant vaccinations, where you get a vaccination and then you get another vaccination and then you want a booster and then another booster and then you have another variant and another booster. And I think most people at some point say to themselves, wow, why do I have to keep getting boosters if this is a vaccine? In any event, we don't want to get canceled by social media, so we're going to keep this on subject, and that is, Dr. Small, what is informed consent?
Well, Mark, informed consent is a communication of understanding between a provider and a patient, or between a medical professional and a patient, where both parties understand the components of informed consent. And those are the three components of risks, benefits, and alternatives to the treatment that you're discussing at the moment. Obviously, when you look at those three together, the benefit is usually probably why you're having that conversation. For example, a blood pressure medicine, if you want the patient to go on a blood pressure medicine, the benefit might mean it's going to lower your blood pressure. But that often is where the conversation stops, because either the patient is satisfied with that, or there is a general understanding that the patient doesn't really want to know any more information, which is the patient's right. But I believe, as a medical professional, that you should continue the discussion to talk about the risks of that particular medication or vaccine or jab or surgery or any other, because we're talking about this in terms of a medical profession.
So who has the ultimate say in a conversation about informed consent? Someone is conscious, they're intelligent, they walk into your office and they ask you about various treatments, and it's ultimately the patient, I take it, that has the right to make decisions about what's best for them?
Yes. I mean, that's one of the ethical principles of medicine called autonomy, where the patient has their control over the decision-making process for their particular body. The only exceptions might be if someone is mentally incapacitated, mm-hmm. or they've given over a power of attorney, a medical power of attorney. Let's say they're in an ICU and intubated, and their wishes have not been expressed in a legal form. They've given their power to their daughter or their wife or their husband to make the medical decisions for them. But either way, whoever's making the decision needs to be able to make the best decision, and that can only be done with the concept of informed consent.
And didn't you say there are 4 tenets?
Yeah,
informed consent?
That's right.
What are they?
4 basic tenets of the ethics of medicine are beneficence, which is to do good, malfeasance, which is to not do bad, autonomy, which is the choice of the person to make the decision for their body, and then there's the concept of justice, which is how do we provide the resources of a limited sense to a group of people in a medical population. How do we distribute the medical care in a sense?
Okay.
So all 4 of these interact on a number of levels to create the discussions that we're having today. If you remember, for example, when COVID first came out, there was a lot of issues with how are we going to treat this large number of people in the ICUs with limited bed capacity, limited ventilator use.
In the early days of COVID.
Yes, the early days.
Sure.
And so that brought in the concept of justice. Like how do we choose who receives the care when we actually have to determine that? Mm-hmm. The concept of do no harm is sort of that Hippocratic oath that you hear people quoting all the time. That's sort of the beneficence, we're going to do good and we're not going to do harm. Those first two, beneficence and malfeasance. And those are the two that most people tend to understand. But the concept of autonomy, which is the patient's right to make that decision, has always been there. But if you look at generations, for example, like if you look back maybe 50, 100 years ago, a lot of people assumed that the doctor was always right, and they just did what the doctor told them. But as we've developed more and more information sources and more understanding of the concept of autonomy, that has become a very predominant part of our ethical discussion of medicine, which goes back to informed consent.
Now it's the government is always right. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it does seem that way sometimes. The idea of informed consent is all based in that ethical principle of autonomy, and that you have the right to know what you're doing to yourself, whether it's getting your appendix out or having an elective procedure to take off the tummy fat on your belly. Nothing that you do, or let's rephrase that. Everything you do has risk and benefit, and you have alternatives. When you get up in the morning and go in the refrigerator and decide you're going to have breakfast, you are making a choice, and that choice obviously has some risks and benefits and alternatives. Getting in your car every day and driving to work, you have risks and benefits and alternatives.
But, progressives don't want you to open up your refrigerator and have choices. They only want you to eat certain, they want you to be vegan, no meat, no dairy. So, but let's get you back on track here.
but the concept is universal. That's what I'm saying. And informed consent is not something that's just medical. It's every day. You try to make the best decisions when you make decisions.
And what you're saying is one of the key tenets of those 4 pillars in medicine is autonomy, the right to make your own decisions.
Absolutely. And that's where we get into these situations where things are mandated down, that you have to do things. And that's an interesting conundrum that we find ourselves in.
Yes, because the idea is you must obey and do as I say because I'm the government and I know what is best for you, basically is saying that one of the key tenets of medicine, namely autonomy, the right to make your own decision, has been suspended or maybe permanently gone under what we've seen with COVID vaccine mandates, at least.
Yes, I think you're right. I think that's the scary part, that a lot of people are finding themselves in this situation where things seem to have gone beyond just the vaccine.
And in your opinion, then informed consent isn't being followed, at least with the so-called COVID protocols and the idea that, you, in order to be able to work in your employee as an employee, you might have to get a vaccine, according to Joe Biden, or in order to be able to get on and go inside of certain restaurants in New York City, you must show your vaccine card that you've been vaccinated. I mean, in your opinion, or at least with your knowledge as a doctor, have you ever seen a time in American history, at least in your lifetime, where you could be denied access simply because of the fact that you didn't have a certain medical procedure?
No, I think in the sense it's been the opposite, really, because we've protected a lot of information. We've protected a lot of rights of health care and knowledge. As our knowledge has grown, we've learned a lot about people and their genetic risks for having cancer, for example, or the fact that they can carry certain risk factors or carry certain diseases, and that might create the concept of ostracization in workplace or in society. And so we've tried to protect those things, and yet now we're not. So
you also brought something else up before we went on air, and that is this idea that with medicine in general, when a doctor engages in malfeasance, the doctor can be sued, and there is a corrective process whereby you say to yourself, or the hospital says to themselves, or the medical practice says to themselves, wow, we're not going to do that again because we got sued. But my point here is you mentioned that doesn't apply to vaccines. In other words, it's not just the COVID vaccine, but as a general principle, vaccines, when something goes wrong, the vaccine manufacturers and or the provider are immune from lawsuits.
Well, the vaccine manufacturers are most definitely. And this came about in the 80s under the Reagan administration, when there had been several problems with vaccine development and a lot of untoward events, including some deaths, even back in the 70s under the Gerald Ford administration with the swine flu vaccine. So vaccine technology back in the early 70s was very minimal. There was the polio vaccine, there was the smallpox vaccine. Those were the two primary ones. And now there's a vast number of vaccines. I've lost track of them. There's scores of vaccines that students would receive or children would receive before they reach adulthood.
And with all of those vaccines, the vaccine manufacturers are exempt from liability.
Yes,
because of the laws that were passed during the Reagan administration.
Yes, they cannot be held accountable for the negative effects of that vaccine. Now,
so what is the corrective process then if you have a vaccine that could be perfected more, because we know more about science as time goes on? This is something that we know because we are becoming smarter, and there is no doubt about that, unless you, of course, are a registered Democrat. But notwithstanding that, what would be the incentive for a vaccine manufacturer to constantly try to perfect their vaccine, to make it better, to make it ever safer, to make it ever more effective, if there's no incentive to do that, because you're never going to get sued over, the bad parts of the vaccine?
Well, the only protection in the checks and balances that you talk about, in the legal system, that check and balance is being sued or losing your license from the state medical board or something along those lines, some kind of regulatory oversight. Well, that's the only thing that's holding the manufacturers of vaccines accountable, is the regulatory oversight of the FDA and the CDC. And at the same time, this law was created to give them immunity, which there was some real questions at the time about whether we should do this, because you can see the law of unintended consequences as we can find ourselves in a situation where there is no true oversight from the purse, right? You can't sue them for a problem. So VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, VAERS, was created at the same time as an early warning system. It's absolutely voluntary, and it's been in existence since the late 80s, early 90s. And it is designed for the public to present information in a database that's now electronic.
The public, not doctors, or both?
Well, both.
Okay, all right.
By public, I mean not the vaccine manufacturer.
So if I have an adverse reaction to a vaccine, or I think that I have,
correct,
then I can use my autonomy in medicine, as an individual, to report that to the VAERS system.
Absolutely.
And so can you as a doctor.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Now, that is designed as an early warning system. It doesn't mean that what you put in there is truth. It's just it's a moment to gather data, and then the government entity can then go in and request records. If you put enough information in there, they have the authority to go in and request the medical records and do an intensive dive down to see if it is potentially vaccine related.
So they can go to the vaccine manufacturer and ask for additional information and data.
And they can go to your hospital and ask for the records to look and see, investigate, basically. So it's a reporting system. That's what it is. VAERS. It's a reporting system, and it's designed to flag things, to say this might be a trend, this might be a pattern that's developing.
My autonomy then in with my own body with respect to vaccines, and with respect specifically to vaccines, to be clear, podcast listeners, is that I can't have a cause of action through an attorney. I can't be autonomous and hire an attorney to try to make the public aware of something that might potentially be wrong. Instead, I have to rely completely on the government for this VAERS system to do the right thing, or at the very least, keep looking at things to see if they're getting better. Is that about right?
Yes.
Okay, so that takes us to, which is interesting, by the way, podcast listeners, because if one of the tenets of medicine is autonomy, and as an individual, I have autonomy, with all other things in medicine, I get to sue the doctor if I think that, and by the way, I'm not that guy, right? I'm not the guy that would want to sue a doctor. But that doesn't mean that there aren't issues when there's malpractice. I mean, there is malpractice in the United States. It does occur. And I get to sue, but not with a vaccine if there is an adverse reaction to the vaccine. So with the VAERS system, what you're saying is, since it's self-reporting to the VAERS system, which is controlled by the CDC or the NIH?
It's part of the CDC.
It's part system, of the CDC. Yes. So that CDC VAERS system is just getting information voluntarily. Do we know where we are now with the vaccines? I mean, if the goal by the federal government is for 100% of the people to get a vaccination, and the vaccinations are so effective and so great, then why wouldn't we have all of that information in front of us, as well as a CD saying, hey, America, please report anything and everything that you're experiencing to the VAERS system so that we can know more and we can continuously try to perfect this?
Well, a lot of things have been reported to VAERS, and that's what's interesting. If you look at a graph of the time frame from the 1990s up until the present day, there is a very consistent plateau, if you will, for most all of the vaccines that are in existence, whether it's the flu vaccine to the chickenpox vaccine.
What does that mean, plateau?
It's very flat. There's not any spikes of reporting. It's very consistent over the last decades that there are a number of things reported, but there's no large jump. There's no significant spike of adverse
reactions. Yes. Okay.
But in the last year, of course, there's a huge spike of adverse events. We've put a new vaccine out there that is inundating the public, and there's a large number of things that are reported. Tens and thousands of adverse events. Now, some of those might be a sore arm, right? Because that could technically be a side effect. But it can be death as well. And there have been somewhere between 10 and 20,000 deaths reported that someone felt was associated to the vaccine.
Where?
All across the country.
In the United States?
In the United States.
And those deaths have been reported by family members who had a loved one who died and they believe it was related to the vaccine, so they voluntarily reported that to VAERS.
Or a physician did it.
Or a physician voluntarily reported it to VAERS.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's up to the government entity to investigate that. Now, I have no clue as to where those things happen, but you can access, it's a public database. It's searchable. Now, it's updated on a regular basis, and it's sometimes batch updated. In other words, things are held for several days and then uploaded all at once. But it's a searchable database that any person can go to and look up. And there are, in fact, various websites that are constantly keeping track of these things. But what's very interesting is because it's a voluntary program, that logically, this is just straight logic, that the number of things that are reported are going to be underreported because it's not a mandatory reporting service. It's not required by law.
Why is it not mandatory, at least for doctors?
Well, that's interesting. I don't know for sure. I don't know the etiology of its creation back in the 80s and early 90s.
If one of the tenets of practicing medicine under informed consent is do no harm, then something happens as a result of a vaccine that you didn't manufacture, but you nonetheless provide to an individual, and something bad happens, it seems that should be reported to the VAERS system by every single doctor every time it happens.
Well, there are certain things that are required to be reported. Doctors are required to report certain types of diseases to the health department, for example. And so there are things that are mandated by law to be reported, but this was never mandated.
So you have to report COVID to the health department.
Right. You have to report COVID. You have to report certain other diseases.
But you don't have to report an adverse reaction to the VAERS system from being vaccinated.
That's right. and maybe it's because it could be, quote, an opinion. But the irony is that it's supposed to be just a reporting system, and the investigation of whether it's true or not is not on the person who's reporting. Just for example, if a physician suspects abuse in a patient, i.e. a child abuse or something like that, or elder abuse, they are mandated to report it. They're not mandated to investigate it. They're mandated to report the thought that it might exist.
Okay.
There's a suspicion. And then an agency like the social work or the law enforcement begins an investigation to see if that's legitimate. And probably sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. But that's not the onus on the physician. The onus on the physician is if you suspect it. And the physician can be held liable if they saw something and didn't report it and it was true.
Okay.
Well, I don't know why that same thing doesn't exist for vaccines, because there are a lot of times a physician would have an opinion, right, that maybe this is something different. But it is actually a little bit time consuming. It takes almost 30 minutes. I filled out some of those reports when I was in the military, and it can take a half an hour or more, and then you can submit accompanying documents and scan them in. It is a little bit cumbersome to do.
So an individual in a state who is a legislator, as an example, could put a bill in that would require all doctors to report adverse reactions from the COVID-19 vaccine that they are witnessing. So that could happen, but
Sure.
at the moment, it's not something that is compulsory.
To my knowledge, it is not compulsory.
Okay. So
now take a caveat. Now, under emergency use authorization, EUA, you are supposed to report because everything is being utilized under emergency use.
Yeah, rushed.
And so theoretically, at this time frame that we're in now, under emergency use, we should be reporting as physicians and patients anything we suspect, right?
Got it. So, and podcast listeners, I want to make something perfectly clear. The reason we're talking about informed consent in this podcast is not because Mark and the Millennials or anyone here is anti-vax, okay? Because when you talk about vaccinations, you're talking about all vaccinations. What we're talking about here is something that is very new, and the need to know and be fully informed about what it is that you're putting into your body, which takes us to my next question to Dr. Small. So let's say I go to the doctor and I say, I'm ready for that vaccine. And I roll up my sleeve and he gives me the jab. What then happens inside my body once the vaccine is injected inside of it? What happens? What makes this so great that it's going to save my life? Or more importantly, let's not go there. Let's just simply talk about what happens. What happens?
The mechanism.
Yes.
And how
thank you.
Well, a traditional vaccine that's been around, from the time of the middle of the last century was to present your body with a form of the disease, the virus itself, usually an attenuated, which means a modified,
non-toxic
version of the virus,
okay,
in order to create your immune system response.
Mm-hmm.
So it was giving you, instead of the virus, it was giving you the virus that had been reduced in some way, but still was present enough to create an immune system response. And that was, for example, the smallpox vaccine, which was given up until the 70s and is attributed to eradicating smallpox worldwide. But the first smallpox vaccines were actually cowpox. They gave a version of smallpox that was not actual smallpox, but it initiated the immune system to fight smallpox. Well, this new concept of mRNA or a DNA type vaccine, because let's be clear, the three that are approved in this country, the Pfizer and Moderna are messenger RNA, and the Johnson & Johnson is a modified DNA. They work very similar, but their mechanism of action is very unique in the sense that it's not the actual virus attenuated or a dead virus or some component of it. They're actually taking the genetic code for one of the proteins of the virus, the spike protein everyone's heard of. And the spike protein is actually, if you've ever seen a picture of the coronavirus, it looks like a ball with all these little legs coming out of it. Someone told me it's almost like a soccer ball with golf tees stuck in it. And all those little golf tees are the spike protein. And that spike protein sticks out, and that's one of the components that you want to create an immune system against. So what they've done is they've taken the coding, the map for creating that spike protein, because we're just a gazillions of proteins. That's what our body is made up of. But it's all mapped out and built in our cells through DNA and RNA and so forth. We manufacture these proteins all the time. So they said, well, why can't we take our cells and use them to manufacture a piece of the virus? So the mRNA, they actually take a code, a map for manufacturing the spike protein, and they get it into your cells. And they do that by wrapping it up in a little package of special lipophilic chemicals, for lack of a better term, this little package, because you can't just inject mRNA into the body. How does it get into the cell? So they have to package it up in like a little Christmas present so it kind of clandestinely gets through the cell membrane. And then once it's in the cell, your cell makes the spike protein.
Okay.
And so you're turning your cell into sort of like a pseudo virus manufacturer. I mean, it's creating a component. And then it puts these little spike proteins out. So it goes into the cell, makes the spike protein, and the spike protein gets presented as if it were the virus. And so now your immune system can come in and do what it normally does and create antibodies and an immune response. And the thought is if you have this immune response in the future, if you were to get the actual virus, which has the spike proteins on it, you will already have antibodies and an immune response against it.
Okay.
So you didn't create the immune response from an actual virus. You faked your cells into making a component of the virus and then elicited the immune response. And this is where it's such a new area. So the Moderna and Pfizer work that way, using messenger RNA. Well, the Johnson & Johnson uses a slightly different technique where it uses modified viral DNA, which is how a virus normally works. The cell actually manufactures the RNA to produce the protein.
Mm-hmm.
Without getting into all the biochemistry of it, they both trick your cells into making spike proteins. That's how they do it. And the question—
stop you there real quickly, because I want you to continue in this direction in this conversation. Well, so why can't your body make these things themselves, make the necessary protections? Since I'm not a doctor, if you get COVID and you're not vaccinated, why are there so many people that have had COVID, weren't vaccinated, and are fine, and their body manufactured the necessary defense?
Well, that's natural immunity. I mean, the whole purpose of the development of any vaccine was to build your immune system up. That's the whole point. Once we discovered the concept of an immune system and the concept of viruses and how things were transmitted from person to person or animal to person, et cetera, the whole idea of a vaccine was to elicit an immune response to protect you in the future.
Okay.
Because they realize that people have protection. Okay, this is classic virology. So in the sense, natural immunity is you have had an immune response to the actual virus itself, the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, and you have created a natural immunity with memory.
Okay.
to protect you if it were to happen again. In other words, if you were to be exposed to COVID again.
We don't know how long that memory lasts.
Well, we don't. But COVID's only been around for a couple of years. We don't have any clue how long it lasts.
And herein lies my question there. So you had COVID. We don't know how long the memory lasts. You weren't vaccinated, but you were fine. Well, why wouldn't your irrespective of whether you have a lasting memory in your cells and you get COVID again 3 years later, wouldn't you still be fine? We don't know.
Well, we don't know because it hasn't been 3 years, but we do know from a lot of studies. There was a study that just came out of Qatar that was put into a major journal here in the United States, and there was one this past summer coming out of Israel that looked at natural immunity and the fact that antibody protection is robust. In other words, people who've had natural protection through exposure to the actual virus have substantial protection against reinfection. And of course, we discussed the last time we were here, the question that was a FOIA request that was put out to the CDC about anyone who's had natural immunity spreading it to someone else. And there was no cases documented according to that FOIA request. So everything is pointing to natural immunity as being effective. The vaccine is an attempt to mimic that natural immunity. But again, it does it in a very unique way. And this cellular creation of the spike protein, therein lies the concept of this informed consent, because it's not what we've always been used to. You know, when you go to say, buy a used car at a used car lot, there's an understanding of informed consent. Like you understand this car has been driven before, this possibly has been in a wreck before, it gets so many miles to the gallon, you've done some research, you understand the risk and benefits, and you understand there's 7 other cars you can pick from. Over time, you have an understanding that you don't need to get in and dig into the deepness of things because you've been buying cars your whole life and you understand a little bit about it. Well, that's how vaccines have worked. Your whole life, you've understood that these vaccines are this way, and there's understanding of some basic risk and benefits that have always been there. But this one's different. And so you can't just use the same boilerplate risk and benefits and alternatives that existed for the last 50 years because it's not. And so it's like going out and buying the latest and greatest new cellular device, okay? There's not any information out there. You don't know what the risks and benefits. Do you remember those cell phones years ago where the batteries would catch on fire?
I sure do.
Okay, but that was because it was a brand new product. It was untested. People bought them because they were the coolest, newest thing, and then they were exploding on them and burning them and causing fires all over the place. And this is just an allegorical analogy of what we're saying here is this is so new that the way you explain the risk and benefits have to be different. You have to look at the fact and you have to tell people we don't know. And it's okay to say that.
Do we know? Which is great. That takes me to, do we know what has been delivered to VAERS in terms of adverse reactions? Do we know what the most common theme would be in terms of adverse reactions?
Well, the most common adverse reactions are the ones that are on the FDA's fact sheets that they say that everyone should be provided, which is a sore arm or symptoms of fevers and malaise and the classic flu shot symptoms that everybody's gotten for the last, 20, 50 years. These are the most common things, but people don't typically have significant adverse events. And VAERS doesn't delineate between it, just says any adverse event. And back to earlier conversations, significant adverse, for example, the myocarditis in young people. That was something that was brought forth in a lot of these reportings, and studies were coming out in other countries, and the FDA did a dive-down investigation and found out it was legitimate. And now there is a black box warning, technically, on these vaccines to say you might have a risk of myocarditis. In fact, that one is actually mentioned as a risk of the vaccine for Pfizer in the FDA fact sheet. But they don't mention the fact that a lot of people associate potential death, potential neuropathies, which are nerve issues, or myopathies, which are muscle issues, blood clotting issues, the issues where there's a question about whether it affects pregnancy or not pregnancy, or the developing fetus. There's so many things that we just do not know. And part of informed consent is the fact that I'm telling you, there's a huge area we don't know. So when you accept the risk of taking this vaccine, you have to understand it's not just like getting the flu shot. It is not. It is very different in its mechanism of action, and we just don't know long term. But when you look at everything compiled together, like the early reporting system of VAERS, among others, there's other reporting systems, and other countries have their various ways of reporting. There's a lot of information out there that calls into question the potential. And when you make the decision for you whether or not to receive this vaccine or not, you make it as a personal decision. Because we do also know that people who are at risk of COVID or significant adverse event from COVID itself, like death, have certain characteristics. They're typically older people, usually over the age of 65 or 70. They typically have a lot of other problems like diabetes or hypertension or obesity, and those people have a significant risk. And so when you are deciding, am I willing to accept the benefit from the vaccine so that I probably will not die from COVID, because that's really all the vaccine does, is it reduces your chances of significant death or adverse events. It doesn't prevent the spread. So I'm willing to take this vaccine to reduce my risk of death, and I'm willing to accept the potential risk of something happening later that we don't know about yet because it's only been around for a year or two. And that's a personal decision. But if you look at the statistics, because that's all you can do when you do risk and benefit, is you quote statistics. That's all you can do. The statistics say that you have a chance of survival that's 99%, that this is not going to kill you. And if you're young and healthy, particularly as a child, you may not even have any symptoms. And so when you look at the risks and benefits and alternatives, which goes back to our earlier podcast conversation of treatment options, if you were to get COVID, which is an alternative to getting the vaccine, is just saying I'm going to get the virus and then treat it because I have low risk of having complications. And you're weighing these risks and benefits of the vaccine versus treatment versus not doing anything at all. And then you truly have informed consent, and you can make that decision. And that decision really is that autonomous ethical decision that we talked about earlier that we seem in some ways to be glossing over because we're not telling people all of these things. If you ask the average person on the street, is this vaccine any different than the one that you got 3 years ago for something else? They would tell you there's no difference because they don't know. They haven't been informed, and they're not being told this.
Well, that raises another question to me, and this is a question I've had for a while, and that is, it appears they're going to constantly be, at least for the foreseeable future, new strains of COVID, new variants. I think that's the term that we hear. And then we have the CDC that has said just yesterday that all adults should get COVID booster shots amid the Omicron fears, Omicron being the new variant, and that if you are 18 years of age, it says here, the federal agency previously said that while every adult was eligible for a booster, only those aged 50 and older and those 18 and above in the long-term care should really make a point of getting it. And so now they're kind of saying, well, yeah, I mean, everybody who's over 18 should get a booster shot. I mean, if we know that we've never had a vaccination made like this before ever in human history, and yet we continuously say, keep getting it, keep getting a new booster. Here's a new one. Here's a new variant. Keep getting another one. This has been my question from the very beginning. Because I grew up in a household where we were pro-vaccine, but we had this really great Hopkins pediatrician who always said to us, I never provide any kind of medicine unless it's absolutely necessary. And by medicine, he meant medications and these kinds of things. And that always stuck with us, because he's like, well, if you're a fundamentally healthy person, why would I give you medicine? And that's kind of the way I grew up with all of my family members. And so when I see this being, well, you need to keep getting boosters, for first, if you got a comorbidity, you've had 2 shots, now get a 3rd shot. Well, now we have a variant, and it may not work so well with the original shot. So we want you to get an additional shot. And it's like, what is this? What is all this medicine doing to you?
Well, we don't know. And I can honestly say that because we don't know. I think everybody gets wrapped up in death, quite frankly, because that was the fear. Remember, when it first came out,
understandable,
it was fear. People are dying, and the ICUs are being overwhelmed, and we're not letting people, go into the old folks' homes, and that's the ultimate fear, right? Because that's the ultimate finality, is death. However, this is not causing a lot of death, but it seems to be having other problems. And we're not looking at that. I really believe in my heart of hearts as a physician that we are just missing all of this. The whole point of these things that we've discussed today with the early reporting system is to bring things to light and cause you to take pause.
Transparency.
Yes, transparency. And we're trying right now to juggle all of this together because, back to your point, viruses mutate, okay? So there's a code, a DNA. Everybody's seen the double helix, the spiral of the DNA. And so you've got this viral DNA, which is the map of how to make the virus, okay? It's the treasure map of how to build the virus and the instructions, the blueprints, if you will. And so there's constant changes in that DNA, but many of those changes mean nothing, right? I mean, even our own DNA is constantly mutating just because of random chance, okay? It statistically happens. In our own body, we have repair mechanisms that keep our DNA going in a positive direction and avoiding things, because when our DNA gets all out of whack, we end up with things like cancer. So the viral DNA is constantly mutating. Well, when those mutations become significant enough to alter the real-world effects of it, we call that a variant. So there's probably been gazillions of mutations that have happened worldwide to this virus, but only certain ones become manifested in reality, and we call that the variant. The first big one was the Delta variant, right, that seemed to alter our entire lives in this last year. Well, this Omicron variant, which is just they're going down the Greek alphabet, and is how they're naming these things. But this thing seems to come out of South Africa. What amazes me is how fast the information can spread, because once they sequence or figure out what these mutations are, you can send those to all of these labs around the world, and all of a sudden they have the blueprints of this variation or this new change, and they're trying to figure out what it's doing. So that's why we've had this collapse of the system and all these restrictions that are coming out around the world in all kinds of different degrees. Mm-hmm. Some countries are shutting down completely. Other countries are saying, well, we're just going to watch and see what happens.
Even though we've already had COVID now for 2 years, you get a new variant and they're like, we must start all over again, as if we don't know anything about this.
Well, and that's true. And I just read yesterday that a Maryland vaccine company, Novavax, is already looking to develop a vaccine against the Omicron. And we just found this out. And so the booster shots and all these things. Now, the question is going to be, is the booster shot going to be classified as something different? Are we going to have to go through another emergency use authorization to get a new type of vaccine? Or is this booster going to be considered some other, subparagraph of some authorization? We're in uncharted territory, but we just don't know. And that's what I have to tell people all the time. We don't fully understand where we are. And fear is driving this.
There's no doubt. And by the way, podcast listeners, speaking of fear, and I want to go back to this conversation briefly, but reported in a number of different media outlets, including Fox News and many others. Obviously, you're not going to see this in MSNBC or CNN. The World Health Organization has confirmed that it skipped the Greek letters nu and xi, as in President Xi, in naming its new COVID-19 variant, which it dubbed the Omicron variant. So in other words, the WHO, they're using the Greek letters to just go down the alphabet to name each of the new variants of COVID. And the next one was new. So they didn't want to call this new COVID. And they didn't want, the next one was Xi, like President Xi. That would actually be that's really kind of ironic.
Yeah.
But it shows you that the World Health Organization has confirmed. It's not like we think they may have. They're like, yeah, we can't use new, even though it's new, a new variant. And we can't use President Xi's name because, it came from China. So therefore, we're going to call it Omicron.
Well,
can't make this stuff up.
No, you really can't. And, eventually.
So it's politicized.
Well, but we know that. We absolutely know, because every country in the world is doing something absolutely different. And it's all based on politics. And there are places around the world that doctors are being completely suppressed and shut down. There are parts of the world where people are being put in quarantine camps. Stuff that we're not seeing that is happening worldwide is people operate under absolute fear. When the statistics, if you really sat down and said, let's talk about the informed consent of just the virus, it is not everything to everybody. Okay? It's a very individualized, unique situation, and that goes back to autonomy. Autonomy is the person.
Correct.
Not the population. Yes. It's the person. And this is where we get into the dilemma between public health and personal health, and security versus freedom, and all of the very complications that we're entering into this world right now with politics of fear and mandates and masks and quarantines.
And by the way, I have no doubt that next year, as we approach the November election next year, there's going to be an election variant, and there'll be a shutdown and mass mail out of ballots again, like they did in 2020, which is another subject. But this politicization of medicine is, to me, one of the most frightening things, because as we talked about the last podcast we're on together, and I mentioned how Obamacare was about the complete and utter takeover of medicine. And now we see an emergency under the auspices of an emergency. The federal government, the CDC, the NIH, and so many other states and governors and the current president of the United States essentially saying, your freedom no longer matters. What matters, as you said, Jim, is the public health matters. So you no longer have autonomy because we are science. We actually had that quick clip from Dr. Fauci, who was on Face the Nation with Margaret Brennan when he said, I am science. In other words, I am God. We have that clip, and here it is.
Anybody who's looking at this carefully realizes that there's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there, so it's easy to criticize. But they're really criticizing science because I represent science. That's dangerous. To me, that's more dangerous than the slings and the arrows that get thrown at me.
So this is what the American people need to take away from this, and I want to hear what Jim has to say as well, of course. But they need to take away from this that you have just ceded, and this is proof what Fauci just said, you, the American people, have ceded your autonomy and your informed consent to Dr. Fauci because he is science, and you're just some idiot who doesn't know how to take care of yourself and can't use your critical thinking skills to make your own decision.
Absolutely. No. And that's the dangerous part, because no one person is science. Science is a mechanism of questioning. It's a mechanism of looking at the world through a different set of glasses and trying to understand things, the cause, effect, the risks, the benefits. And what he's really saying is he's looked at all of the information and he has determined which information he thinks is the best information. And therefore he is right. And they argue that their panel of experts has gotten together and their panel of experts has made these decisions. But I would argue that science develops from critical thinking, and very often it's the minority opinion that is the correct opinion. If you look historically, a great deal of our, quote, science, unquote, was developed by the person who was in the minority at the time. And it just took an evolution of information and time itself to prove those people correct. And so when you ignore the opposite opinion, when you ignore the myriad physicians worldwide which are advocating for medical treatment versus vaccinations, or questioning the very nature of the vaccine itself, like the creator of the mRNA vaccine himself, these things you cannot just discount.
So the creator of the mRNA vaccine itself, catch me on that again, he has what?
Well, he's questioning whether this is the right time or the right understanding, that we don't have enough information. Basically, this entire thing is a big experiment. And this is what people don't realize, that we're all participating in an experiment. And that's part of informed consent.
Yes.
Do you really understand that you are in an experiment? You agreed to allow yourself to be part of an understanding of something this new. And when someone says, I don't want to be a part of it, that is their choice. You know, we're in this mix right now. I'll finish up on this thought. You know, we have this approved Pfizer vaccine, Comirnaty or something like that. I can't remember exactly. But yet we're also under the emergency use authorization. All vaccines for children are still under emergency use, yet vaccines for older folks are not under emergency use, but yet we're still using the emergency use version of the Pfizer vaccine, which legally is different than the actual approved vaccine, which has not been manufactured and distributed nationwide yet. So we're in this strange hybrid world right now where we're existing under these various mechanisms, some legal, some medical, and so forth. And again, you go back to the individual. You've got to talk to the person and say, do you understand what you're doing for you at this moment in your life? And not look at this giant picture, because everyone right now is part of, quote, the science that Fauci is talking about, because we're all learning. We're all learning.
So we are, to the extent that we have received a vaccine, are part of an experiment, of a new experiment, because it's a new vaccine and we don't really know the long-term effects of this vaccine on our bodies. And the thing that I really wanted to ask you before we go, and I know the podcast listeners want to know this as well, and that is, do we know the effects, or have we heard about through the VAERS system the effects of the COVID vaccine on children? And why are we rushing as a country to push the vaccine all the way down to someone who's 5 years old? I mean, what is the rush? Because the vast majority of children are incredibly healthy. I can certainly understand under informed consent being a parent and saying, hey, my child has Down syndrome. What is the impact of this vaccine? And should I get it, especially for my child because they have Down? I get that. I get those questions. But the vast majority of children are healthy. What is the rush to force this vaccine on children, the healthiest segment of our society?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question, because it doesn't make sense to me either. The fact that we are asking the healthiest part of the population, who have the lowest risk, to take something into their body with no true understanding of any long-term effects and known problems that exist, is unbelievable, quite frankly. I do not understand it, and I do not get why we are rushing this situation, because there is a lot of concern that still exists out there, and we got a lot more to talk about.
And for pregnant women?
Same thing.
Same thing.
Absolutely the same thing. They can look at short-term studies and show that probably there's no effect, but we have no idea. We have zero idea because there is no time that's passed. And we don't know what the long-term effects are on the newborn infant or the maternal ability to produce a viable pregnancy. We have evidence right now that is accumulating, but we don't have any body of evidence that says one way or the other. It just doesn't exist.
Got it. Dr. Jim Small, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Incredible podcast. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. That's it for this particular podcast, which is Informed Consent. And thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials, and thank you especially to Dr. Jim Small. Also to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.